The legendary crime buster J. Edgar Hoover. Was he part of an FBI conspiracy to put an innocent man in prison for 30 years? As we first reported last January, it's an explosive allegation. Did Hoover, head of the FBI for half a century, deliberately sit on evidence that would have freed the man? A congressional investigation into alleged corruption and misconduct in Hoover's FBI has so angered the Congress that they've delivered a subpoena to Attorney General John Ashcroft, demanding documents they hope will explain just why the FBI hid evidence that cost this innocent man, name of Joseph Salvati, 30 years behind bars.
It's just unthinkable that that could happen in America. Joe Salvati and his wife Marie are going to testify today.
A disillusioned Dan Burton, Republican congressman, chairman of the House Committee on Government Reform, says this case has destroyed his faith in a man he once revered.
I always thought J. Edgar Hoover walked on water when I was a kid. When I found out Mr. Salvati had been put in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and they knew it, the FBI, for 32 years, and there was no remorse because of it, I said something has to be done.
The government stole more than 30 years of my life.
Joseph Salvati spent those stolen years in prison, falsely and maliciously accused of murder by this man, Joseph the Animal Barboza, a contract killer for the mob who became an unlikely star witness in the FBI's war against the mob.
Joe Barboza was an assassin. He was a hitman for the mafia.
Jim Wilson, chief counsel for Burton's committee, has spent the past year investigating why the U.S. government would make a deal with the likes of Barboza.
Everybody in New England knew exactly who he was. They knew that he killed people, and he killed people for fun.
What could he offer the FBI? That they would permit him to commit murders and lie on the stand in the name of justice?
Well, I think what he offered was what they wanted.
And what they wanted back in the 60s was to break the back of the mob. J. Edgar Hoover, embarrassed after insisting for years there was no such thing as the mafia, suddenly became a man on a mission to bring down organized crime. And with one witness, Joseph Barboza, the FBI thought they could do it, at least in New England. Barboza, facing life in prison as a career criminal, was eager to make a deal. And so in exchange for his testimony against high-level organized crime figures in a number of upcoming trials, the Department of Justice promised Barboza he would stay out of prison.
They knew that they had made a deal with the devil, and that's okay sometimes. But you've got to make sure that the person's telling you the truth. And the federal agents knew that the stories he was telling were not true.
Hoover looks like a co-conspirator with the mob.
The ends justified the means. The law didn't matter. And it appears that people wanted to do whatever they could do to achieve a goal. And people like Joe Salvati be damned.
Which brings us to how Joe Salvati, a truck driver who grew up in a close-knit Italian family and married his childhood sweetheart Marie, how he got fingered for a murder he did not commit. Salvati, it turns out, had made the mistake of his life when he borrowed $400 from a loan shark who had ties to Barboza. When he couldn't pay it back, Barboza found a way to get even. On his word alone, Salvati was arrested as the getaway driver in a mob murder that Barboza himself had masterminded. Out of the blue, the cops come and arrest you for murder. You were shocked.
Shocked wasn't the word. They had to sit me down, and you know, I was numb.
And then what, they took you off?
Then they booked me, and that was the beginning of a nightmare.
And that nightmare played out at this courthouse in downtown Boston where Joe Salvati was put on trial back in 1968 for the gangland slaying of a local thug. Barboza, the government's star witness, testified for more than a week. And you were sentenced to life in prison.
Right.
34 years old.
Right.
4 youngsters.
Right.
And Mr. Wallace, let me tell you, he got a life sentence and we got a life sentence with him.
How old were the kids at the time?
4, 7, 9, and 11.
And all of a sudden their dad
is out of our lives.
How often did you visit Joe in prison?
I would go every week, and I'd take...
Every week?
Yes.
For 30 years?
Mostly, yes.
While Joe Salvati did hard time in one of the toughest prisons in the country, Joe the Animal Barboza not only got away with the murder he'd planned, he was given a new identity and a new start in California. The U.S. government thought that Barboza was so valuable to them that they basically developed the witness protection program for him. He was the first guy in.
Yes, and while he was in the witness protection program, we know he murdered one person, and it's believed he murdered several others. And he was protected by the FBI.
That's right. When Barboza was arrested for first-degree murder in California, a virtual parade of U.S. officials, 2 FBI agents, an assistant U.S. attorney, showed up to testify as character witnesses. Not surprisingly, Barboza got lucky again. He served less than 4 years for the murder. Where is Joe Barboza today? He died as he lived, gunned down on the streets of San Francisco back in 1976. And any hope Joe Salvati had that the truth might one day be told died along with Barboza and his perjured testimony.
In prison, you live on hope that they're going to come up with an appeal and you're going to get a good answer. But it never happened. And 5, 10 years went by, and you know, it looks kind of dim until I met a man named Victor Garrow.
Victor Garrow.
My attorney.
Victor Garrow operates a one-man law office outside Boston. He had never defended an accused mobster. He'd given up defense work entirely. But there was something about Joe Salvati.
From the very first time that he told me the facts, I said there's something wrong in this case. As a matter of fact, many of my friends said, do you understand what you're taking on? You're going to take on the FBI, the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, District Attorney's Office. And they said, you have one hell of a fight in your hands.
What kept you going? You've not taken a dime for this. I hate to think, if the clock were ticking, how many hours was involved.
Over 20,000, we've stopped counting.
Those long hours paid off when Garrow found what he thought was the proof he needed to free Salvati. The original police report, which somehow had never been turned over during the trial. Imagine Garrow's reaction when he discovered a police informant had identified Joe Barboza and 6 known mobsters as the actual killers just one day after the gangland slaying. And Joe Salvati's name is nowhere in that report.
Absolutely correct.
It was not turned over by whom to whom, and was that an honest mistake or...
Nothing in this case was by mistake. Everything was intentional and willful.
This sounds like an improbable conspiracy.
Everything that I say, I have evidence to back up.
But until a reporter for the CBS affiliate in Boston, name of Dan Ray, began reporting on that evidence, no one was taking Victor Garrow very seriously.
Victor starts off telling me he's going to tell me about the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I truly thought at that moment, this guy's tapioca.
But before too long, Ray, who has a law degree and a lot of sources in law enforcement, became convinced that Garrow's wild conspiracy theory was right.
I'm somebody who believes most people in prison belong there. But this shocked me, that people in law enforcement would betray their badge in order to win a conviction. I strongly believe that justice had to be done in this case.
Live, this is Eyewitness News.
And so, for 4 years, WBZ aired report after report on Dan Ray's investigation, which resulted in a groundswell of public support for Salvati's release. But his nightmare continued. He remained behind bars. How did you not turn bitter during all of this?
I was bitter, I was bitter at the beginning, but you can't let that eat you up.
But thinking all that time, I didn't do this.
Right.
They swindled me.
Took my family, my life.
Holidays, Christmas.
Oh, there was a void in our life. Every holiday, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and graduations, birthdays, first communions, confirmations. I mean, you know, you're talking about 30 years.
This should never happen again. Nobody.
And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the nightmare ended for Salvati in 1997. It's not clear just what convinced the governor of Massachusetts to change his mind, but Joe Salvati was finally paroled. You were the first person Joe Salvati embraced when he got out of prison.
On March 20th of 1997, I walked Joe Salvati out of prison. Daddy's home. Yeah. Come on in, I can...
Day you finally got out. 30 years. At you hadn't been a free man.
It was sky high, you know. We had everybody there.
To have happiness,
Very happy there.
beginning of life.
Salvati had his freedom, but he was still a convicted killer on parole. He and Victor Guerra were determined to clear his name. 3 years passed, and then 1 week before Christmas in the year 2000, salvation came in a phone call.
I received a call from the Assistant U.S. Attorney, John Durham, who was in charge of the Justice Task Force. And he says, Victor, you going to be there tonight?
That night, Guerra got evidence the defense attorney only dreams of getting. Dozens of documents which showed unequivocally that the FBI knew Salvati was innocent before he even went on trial.
I was in a state of shock.
These are memos or?
These are actual documents kept by the FBI, which were sent to J. Edgar Hoover. And I said, thank you, God.
There was, in fact, a conspiracy at the top of the United States government to keep Joe Salvati in jail in order to protect informant murderers and liars and so forth.
That's what the evidence shows. Tens of thousands of pages, and when you go through it all, that's the conclusion.
And J. Edgar Hoover presided over all of this.
From what we've seen, he was kept informed of what was going on an almost daily basis.
I've seen some of the documents to the director, and using names, places, dates, events. So he had to know.
It's a shocking thing.
Commonwealth versus Salvati is now officially over.
Those no longer secret FBI memos succeeded in undoing 30 years of injustice. Joe Salvati's conviction was overturned. But despite the exoneration, no one in the U.S. government has made a move to compensate Salvati and his family for the 30 years he was falsely imprisoned.
They, in their own minds, know what they should do.
Guerra was angry at the idea that he should have to sue the federal government, which would no doubt take years.
You know what it is, Mike? They hope he dies before he gets the money.
Which raises the obvious question. What price do you put on the 30 years stolen from Joe Salvati?
Well, I don't think there's anything in the world we could ever do to make restitution for the 32 years his wife had to suffer, his children had to suffer,
Right.
and he had to suffer. But I do believe that the state of Massachusetts and the federal government owe this man compensation.
You've called this case one of the greatest, if not the greatest, failure in American justice, in history.
I believe it is.
And he didn't stop there.
J. Edgar Hoover knew Mr. Salvati was innocent, and yet he let Mr. Salvati go to prison. That was a miscarriage of justice. He knew it, and his name should not be emblazoned on the FBI headquarters. We ought to change the name of that building.
You serious?
Yes, sir, I'm serious.
Chairman Burton is so serious that he says that he will introduce legislation this summer to strip J. Edgar Hoover's name from FBI headquarters. The man who prosecuted Joe Salvati has now apologized, says that if the FBI had produced any of the documents that have now come to light, he never would have indicted Salvati in the first place. As for the Department of Justice, they have made no move to compensate Joe Salvati for the 30 years he spent in prison.